This is lesson 13 for the Catholic Reformation, or you can call it the Counter-Reformation. What reforms did the Catholic Church make, and how did it respond to Protestant reform movements? And we've got College Board topic 2.5, the Catholic Reformation. Explain the continuities and changes in the role of the Catholic Church from 1450 to 1648. So you see a historical thinking skill right there, continuities and changes, don't we? The Catholic Reformation, exemplified by the Jesuit order and the Council of Trent, revived the church but cemented division within Christianity. After this, all of that will mean something to you. The place, well, lots of places actually, Spain, Italy, really all over Europe. And here's our introduction. Another common name for the Catholic Reformation is the Counter-Reformation. So once again, you have two names for the same thing. Not the last time we'll see that. And by the 1450s, the Catholic Church was faltering. Catholic Church had lost millions of adherents. Entire provinces had been lost to Protestantism. And doctrinal assaults by Christian humanists and Protestants had caused a lot of doubt among Catholics. And these doctrinal assaults undermined the Catholic clergy's confidence and resolve. How many of these assaults were valid? Was the Catholic message still worth fighting for? Was the Catholic Church still relevant? The New World was opening up. We learned all about that. The expansion of Europe into the New World needed to be a Catholic expansion. And the Catholic Church needed to reorganize and revitalize if it was going to remain relevant and accomplish that objective. Papal reform and the Council of Trent. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese became Pope Paul III in 1534. He was a Roman noble, he was tough, he was skilled, and he was experienced. And Pope Paul III became the man whom historians call the father of the Catholic Reformation. He was one of the most important popes in the history of the Catholic Church, and he had two objectives for the Catholic Church. First, reconvert Protestants wherever possible, and second, convert people who are on the fence wherever possible. And in order to do that, Pope Paul III decided to go on a militant, not military, militant counterattack. To accomplish these things, Pope Paul III put together a three-part strategy. First, the Catholic Church had to clearly define its doctrines. Up to this point, the Church had never really done this in an outwardly focused way. It had never needed to. It had never had the kind of competition that the Protestant Reformation had offered to it. They needed to clearly define some basic things: who we are, who they are, what the differences are, and what the choices are. Next, the Catholic Church had to tighten up church discipline. Stricter rules for behavior and rules against corrupt practices were needed. Better training and education of clergy needed to be done, and a more aggressive organization needed to be created. Next, the Catholic Church had to take a new stand against the Protestants. The Church's previous reaction to Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin had been a mixture of fear and neglect and denial of reality. The Catholic Church needed to be more assertive and aggressive. And the Church had to be more militant, that is to say, more active, more vigorous, more forceful, more fierce, more passionate. And Pope Paul III's actions were thus: number one, he made it absolutely clear to the Church that the Pope was in charge. He was the boss. He was the head honcho. And then Pope Paul III reformed various internal abuses. The Church had to get its own house in order before it could go after the Protestants. And Pope Paul III got lots and lots of pushback on these changes, but he slogged his way through. Pope Paul III had various tools for reform at his disposal. In 1542, Pope Paul III established the Roman Inquisition, also called the Holy Office. One institution, two names. And the Roman Inquisition, the Holy Office, was a traveling court of 6 cardinals that would try cases of heresy. Inquisitions had been nothing new, but the Holy Office was different and new in 2 ways. Number one, it came directly from Rome, carrying Rome's authority. And number 2, it was universal. In other words, it had jurisdiction everywhere. The Holy Office's mission on any case was to decide this. Number 1, what was within the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, and number 2, what was outside the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. So the process of determining orthodoxy and heresy was now new and centralized, and the Holy Office had the authority to arrest, imprison, and even execute heretics. The Holy Office published the Index of Prohibited Books, and this was a list of books that true believers were not to read. Christian humanist authors were on the list. All of the Protestant authors were on the list, and reading the books listed on the Index of Prohibited Books was considered a sin. Pope Paul III appointed more reform-minded cardinals to the College of Cardinals, and this was a governing body that elected the next pope. So Pope Paul III wanted to be sure that when he died, the next pope after him would follow in his footsteps. And so if he packed the College of Cardinals with more people like himself, that was more likely to happen. In 1545, Pope Paul III called the Council of Trent. And the goal of the Council of Trent was this: to clearly define church doctrine so that the church could be ready to counterattack the Protestant Reformation intellectually. And calling a council like this was somewhat risky because there was always the fear that if you called a council together, that council would try to get control of the church from you. And this showed that Pope Paul III was on solid enough ground that he overcame his fear of church councils. It also showed how dire the situation was for him to be willing to do this. And the council met and worked on and off from 1545 to 1563. That's 18 years. Pope Paul III had hoped to use the Council of Trent to somehow reconcile things with the Protestants, and he invited both Lutherans and Calvinists to participate in the Council of Trent, but this effort failed for several reasons. For one thing, the Lutherans and the Calvinists both insisted on sola scriptura, Scripture alone, as a basic assumption for any and all doctrinal discussions, and this was something that Pope Paul III simply could not agree to, could not accept. Sola scriptura means if it's not in the Bible, it's not valid. And Lutherans and Calvinists refused to discuss any religious doctrine based on non-biblical sources, such as traditions or church decrees or articles of faith. Also, powerful forces were working against any kind of reconciliation between the Catholic Church and the Lutherans or the Calvinists. For example, Charles V, he didn't want the Council of Trent to alienate Lutherans in the Holy Roman Empire, which he was by this time trying to unify. And the leaders of France, they didn't want the Council of Trent to work. They wanted Catholics and Lutherans to remain divided because that division weakened the Holy Roman Empire. And finally, in 1563, the Council of Trent presented the results of its legislation. The council did acknowledge disciplinary problems that needed to be addressed, and we have identified nearly all of those problems. Bishops now had to live where their dioceses were. There would be no more absenteeism, no more pluralism, no more simony, no more concubines for priests. Priests couldn't have girlfriends. No more sales of indulgences. Indulgences were gone, they were out. And every diocese had to establish a seminary to train and educate clergy. Training of clergy needed to emphasize preaching and educating the laity, the lay people, you and me. And seminary professors had to evaluate whether or not a candidate had a genuine calling for the priesthood. And lay people who got married had to give their vows in public before a priest and witnesses. Not having this rule had caused quite a few legal issues over the generations. But the Council of Trent also reaffirmed Catholic doctrine and stood its ground in a clear, strong, and uncompromising way. The council made no effort whatsoever to compromise with the Protestants on any issue. The message was simple. This is us. Here's what we stand for. That's them. That's what they stand for. Here's the line. Make your choice, and your choice has consequences. So the Council of Trent offered Christians a clear choice: heaven or hell, us or them. Specifics of the Council of Trent. All difficult issues will be decided by the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas had been a very important 13th century theologian, and his writings were extremely comprehensive, and his positions would remain definitive. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas retained this status in the Catholic Church all the way until the 1960s. All parts of Catholic Church doctrine that the Protestants had previously attacked were now reaffirmed. We are keeping everything, and we are ready to debate that. Specifics of the Council of Trent's heaven or hell, us or them doctrine. This is how you get to heaven: faith and good works. The Protestants had said that it was faith alone. Catholic Church disagreed and were standing their ground. Sacraments, all 7 sacraments, every single one, were valid and essential. The Protestants had argued that there were only 2 sacraments, not 7. Catholic Church said no, keeping all 7. The Council of Trent upheld transubstantiation as true, important, and central to the life of the believer. Many Protestants had argued that there was no such thing as transubstantiation, that the wine and the bread were symbolic and memorial. Priests had certain abilities that lay people did not have, and these abilities reflected an institutional church power. And so priests, therefore, had a corresponding high standing in society. God should be worshipped with elaborate ritual and ceremony. These things emphasized God's greatness and power and majesty. And remember, many Protestants had argued against that and had removed and whitewashed ornate church decorations and removed ritual from worship services in order to, as they saw it, get to the heart of true, pristine worship. And Scripture, the Bible, and church traditions shared equal validity as sources of truth and authority. And as we know, Protestants had argued for sola scriptura. Protestants had argued that the Bible was the only source of truth and authority. All other sources were suspect, sources such as tradition and culture and church law. Catholic Church, Council of Trent said, nope, they're all good. So the bottom line of the Council of Trent was this: we admit that there are some disciplinary matters that we need to fix, but when it comes to doctrine, we got it right the first time, and we are ready to go toe-to-toe in vigorous debate with Protestants anywhere, anytime. So the Council of Trent's legislation ruled the Catholic Church all the way up to the mid-20th century. New and Reformed religious orders. These religious orders had several things in common. Number one, they were heavily influenced by the values of the Council of Trent. And number two, they emphasized education. Number three, they emphasized outreach. They wanted to improve society through Christian teaching and discipline. And they wanted to get out there and answer the arguments of the Protestants. Well, we've got Saint Teresa of Avila. She was a Spanish noblewoman, and she belonged to an order of nuns called the Carmelites. And she became a social celebrity, actually, in her home province in Spain. And while recovering from a near-fatal illness, she started getting quite dramatic, actually, mystical visions that lasted 2 years and shaped the rest of her life. And Teresa wrote extensively and in great detail, actually, about her visions and her life and her reform efforts and her religious views. And these writings greatly influenced church doctrine and practice. Teresa was extremely disturbed by the atmosphere of laxity that had taken over convent life, and she held the Protestant Reformation largely responsible for this recent lack of purpose and focus among convents. And she reformed her order, the Carmelites, by bringing it up to stricter standards for both men and women. She introduced asceticism into the order, and she also introduced vows of poverty into the order. Teresa of Avila received a lot of resistance to these reforms from within the Carmelite order and from the church. And she was even investigated by the Inquisition on charges that her visions had come from Satan rather than God. Those charges were later dropped. Teresa of Avila traveled extensively and founded 17 new convents. Angela Marizzi. She was Italian. She spent years helping the poor, the sick, and the uneducated. And Marizzi founded the Ursuline Order of Nuns in 1565. And she dedicated this order to educating young girls. And the order's goal was to re-Christianize all of society, specifically through the education of future wives and mothers. But the biggest order of all was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. These were the foot soldiers in the attack on the Protestants. They were at the heart of the Counter-Reformation, and they were a very aggressive order. They had very definite beliefs, and they had a very charismatic leader, Ignatius Loyola, or Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola lived from 1491 to 1556, and he was Spanish. He was the son of a poor Basque nobleman. Poverty was not uncommon in many noble families. And Loyola had never known wealth, and he had never had any training in theology. Loyola was a professional career soldier, and that was very significant. His leg was almost blown off in a battle, and he spent months recovering in the hospital, and his career as a soldier was over at that point. And in the hospital, Loyola read about the lives of the saints to pass the time. And he developed a very unique view of Christianity. Loyola's early view of Christianity was this. He saw the church as a military-type force. Of course, he's a soldier. And he saw the church going against the forces of the devil, in other words, the beliefs of the Protestants. And Loyola finally got out of the hospital, and he wandered around for a while. And then he retired to a monastery. And in this monastery, Loyola spent 10 months contemplating his sin. And while he was there, Loyola got an 8-day-long vision. And you can see a painting of this vision right here on the right. And in this vision, God gave Loyola an outline of the book that he was to write. And so that book was called The Spiritual Exercises, published in 1548. And it was intended to be a guide for every good Christian. But unfortunately, it was way too rigorous. Of course, he's a soldier. It was way too rigorous for the vast majority of Christians. And the most important part of this book is actually explained on page 417 of our textbook. This book appealed really to an elite kind of Christian, and it eventually became the guidebook for the Jesuits. And here's a picture of Loyola holding his book. A lot of times, if you see a picture of Loyola, he's always holding his book, The Spiritual Exercises. So Ignatius Loyola made a pilgrimage all the way to Jerusalem. He wanted to preach and teach and practice poverty, but he knew that his education was inadequate to the task. And so Loyola therefore studied theology at the university in Spain, and there Loyola met 3 lifelong companions. Our textbook says 6, other sources say 3. And they finished their studies together in Spain. They continued their theological studies at the University of Paris, and the 4 of them had this religious experience in which God told them to go on a crusade against the Ottoman Turks. And so they all met up in Venice and found that there were no ships available to go to crusade against the Turks. So the companions needed a plan B. And so they went to Rome, where they quickly made a name for themselves, preaching, teaching, and selflessly helping the poor. And they even got the attention of our hero, Pope Paul III himself. And he met the companions, and he was very impressed with them, and he ordained them all priests. And they approached Pope Paul III for permission to form a religious order. And at first, Pope Paul III hesitated and didn't quite trust this, but they swore personal fealty specifically to the Pope, and so that he granted them permission to form this order, and that's how the Jesuits were born. The Jesuits were going to take the fight for the hearts and minds of people straight to the Protestants. And they started energetically reconverting converted Protestants, and they started going after those wavering masses who were on the fence. And the 4 major functions of the Jesuits were, number 1, preaching. Has to be skilled, it has to be convicted, it has to be passionate, it has to be knowledgeable. Number 2, teaching. Teaching of doctrine, teaching of history of the church, and teaching of proper behavior. Number 3, confession to the nobles. Being a confessor to a powerful noble was a position of great responsibility and power in and of itself. And 4, missions. Taking Catholicism all over the world. Most other orders are dedicated to things like prayer and helping the sick and helping the poor, teaching in later religious orders. But the Jesuits, they wanted to be on the front lines. They didn't want to be cloistered up in some monastery. And so they founded some of the finest schools in Europe, and these schools were very disciplined. They offered a cutting-edge education. They had a broad humanistic education. They taught Catholic theology, and many famous thinkers were educated in these schools as kids, including Voltaire, who we'll meet later, and including Descartes, who we'll meet later. And the Jesuits had spectacular worldwide success as missionaries. At this time, teaching and preaching were the very things that the Catholic Church was notoriously bad at. And up to this time, the Protestants had enjoyed an advantage. They had had the superior knowledge and the superior eloquence. But now the Jesuits were taking on the Protestants at their own game, and they were successfully out-arguing Protestants in public theological debate. And people were beginning to respect the Catholic Church again because they respected the Jesuits. The Jesuits excelled at worldwide missionary work. The Protestants weren't really doing this yet. Instead, they were leaving the mission field wide open for the Jesuits. The Jesuits concentrated on becoming confessors to important people, and they forged the so-called alliance of throne and altar. And the Jesuits made a big effort to be the confessors to the ruling nobles of Catholic Europe. And this gave the Jesuits great influence in public affairs.